Since the Russian invasion that began on February 24, 2022, the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine has been one of the main combat zones. This industrial center on the border between the two countries became a strategic target for Moscow, prompting brutal attacks to conquer it. However, local forces have fought fiercely to resist, as in the case of the 92nd Assault Brigade, which was the protagonist of an incredible confrontation. The soldiers of this unit did not hesitate to defend their lands and fought against 2 powerful tanks and a dozen heavily armed Russians. If you want to know the story of this epic clash and the bloody dispute that has developed in Kharkiv since the beginning of the conflict, then stay with us because we are going to find out in this new video from Military Force. Put on your helmet. Here we go. Gunshots, explosions, ruined buildings, and blood. Lots of blood. That is war for the inhabitants of Kharkiv, where fighting has been intense and prolonged since the beginning of hostilities by Russia. The region has seen several phases of conflict, from direct assaults and bombings to successful counteroffensives by Ukrainian forces. The clashes there began from the first minute of the conflict that broke out in February 2022, after Russian President Vladimir Putin gave the order to carry out a special military operation in neighboring territory. In this way, after several months of tension between the two countries, with more than 150,000 soldiers deployed on the borders, the battle broke out. Moscow's offensive in the Kharkiv region was one of the first objectives due to its location. The Russian forces grouped in Belgorod only had to cross the political boundaries that divide the cities and use their firepower to conquer that territory. However, the Kremlin troops did not count on the strong Ukrainian resistance. Local forces had prepared for a fierce defense, knowing the strategic importance of the place, and that sparked intense fighting during the first days of the war. The location of the city, just 40 kilometers from the border, is one of the natural accesses for Russian troops who seek to project their power in eastern Ukraine. In addition, the area acts as a key logistical corridor between Moscow and other regions of its neighboring country, especially thinking about the way to the center and south of the nation. Because of this, controlling Kharkiv would allow Vladimir Putin's forces to move their soldiers, equipment and supplies more efficiently within a plan of large-scale conquest.
Щоб піти на даний час вперед, щоб здвинулась трохи лінія фронту, нам надо снаряды, нам надо заряды, нам надо пополнение людей, нам надо техника, чтобы... Если у нас этого сейчас ничего не будет, мы будем стоять на одном месте, и если противник понимает, что у нас ресурсов уже 0, то он, естественно, может спокойно на нас давить.
Kharkiv also represents a major hub for factories producing military equipment, heavy machinery, chemicals, and electronics. Thus, the industrial capacity of the region is crucial to the Ukrainian war effort, even more so if aid from allied nations is delayed. Added to this is the fact that the area is home to critical infrastructure, including power plants, railways, and communication centers. Controlling these resources is as essential as equipment when it comes to sustaining military operations over time. Given all these strategic keys and with their plans for a rapid occupation thwarted, the Russians did not hesitate to launch a massive bombing campaign on Kharkiv using artillery, rockets, and missiles. These attacks caused great destruction in residential areas, hospitals, and schools, and resulted in a high number of civilian casualties. But that was only the beginning. Between March and May 2022, fighting continued there. But as control seemed impossible, Putin's forces also sought to take neighboring towns, such as Izium, located to the south, and Kupiansk in eastern Kharkiv. The former in particular was a strategic target due to its position as a communications hub. After intense fighting and much bloodshed, Russian troops managed to capture them. However, although some areas were occupied, Ukrainian forces organized resistance tactics, including guerrilla attacks and sabotage against their enemies. In this way, they achieved sporadic victories that helped delay the advance of the Kremlin soldiers. For several months, there was sustained fighting in Kharkiv, which seemed to be wearing down both sides. But in September 2022, the men from Kiev surprised their rivals with a lightning counteroffensive, carrying out a rapid and highly coordinated attack in the region.
Нет. Дым? Да, дым. На входе там их куры. Сдавайся, долбоёб! Дивись туда. Сука, він отстрілюється. Давай, закидуй йому гранату.
The Russians were not expecting these actions, which denied them the chance to react and resist. In many cases, they were forced to hastily retreat, leaving behind large amounts of military equipment. A substantial loss in wartime, as it was not just rifles or ammunition, but huge advanced tanks such as the T-90s. During this counteroffensive, Kiev's forces quickly recaptured large areas, including key cities such as Kupiansk and Izium. The liberation of these places was seen as one of Ukraine's most significant victories in the war. However, the successes would be overshadowed by the incessant presence of their enemies, as Putin's men were not willing to give up so easily. After control of the region returned to the Ukrainians, Russian forces took the determination to bomb the place until it was reduced to rubble. Since then, artillery and missile attacks have targeted both military and civilian infrastructure, with the city of Kharkiv remaining the primary target, causing destruction and death. Throughout 2023 and into 2024, the region has been subject to such offensives as the Ukrainians carry out extensive operations to clear minefields and secure previously occupied areas. However, this latter objective is far from easy. Russian troops continue to try to regain control of different strategic points, resulting in ongoing fighting. Within these conflicts, the incredible confrontation between the 92nd Assault Brigade and powerful enemy armored vehicles took place. A group of soldiers from this unit, belonging to the unmanned vehicle attack battalion called Achilles, was in charge of defending their homeland while the men from Moscow tried to capture the city by attacking it from two directions. On one of these fronts, the Russians coordinated electronic attacks that became effective when they managed to disable the communications of Ukrainian battalions that protected the area. In this way, a relative initial success was achieved in the advance of the men from the Kremlin. However, when it came to breaking through the rival defensive lines, Putin's soldiers showed difficulties in launching assaults in an articulated manner. This is due to the lack of leadership and adequate training of the reserve troops that have joined the units due to the lack of personnel. On the other combat front, the Ukrainians encountered the advance of Russian troops from Sinkivka, a small town in the city of Kupiansk. Their task would not be easy, as in this case a dozen Kremlin fighters were marching in an overwhelming manner accompanied by two lethal armored vehicles. However, the 92nd Brigade had arrived from Donetsk with a clear objective, and if necessary, it would fight to the death for the Kharkov resistance.
Подъехали на позицию, будем работать по киллерам. Наводчик сел в управление Чебурашка, сейчас наводится по координатам, по которым мы будем работать. Сейчас выставляет все и начинаем пристрелочки, кидаем. Стреляем, фиксируем.
The Russians prepared their equipment, an MTLB and a BMP-3. The first of these is a Soviet-made amphibious infantry vehicle, which entered service in the late 1960s and is used as a platform for mounting various weapon systems. The second is one of the best combat armored vehicles in Putin's ranks, capable of causing great destruction. They were the perfect weapons to advance and try to assault the positions of the Ukrainian defenders. For this reason, confident in their striking power, the Russians headed into open country to deal a heavy blow to their rivals. However, the offensive was carried out in a disorganized manner, since the 12 Russian soldiers in charge of the mission did not have heavy armored vehicle cover, nor sufficient intelligence work or adequate training. In contrast, the 92nd Ukrainian Assault Brigade had carried out the necessary studies to have an accurate notion of the terrain and their rival. He was also aware that he had a better military preparation. However, he also knew that Russian weapons posed a great challenge for the unit. And if they failed, enemy troops could get close enough to launch a fierce artillery attack on Kharkiv. The pressures led to a dramatic confrontation in which the Kiev forces returned the attack using all available means, including drones and missile batteries. One of the keys to success would be a high level of interaction between the commands, that is, constant communication on how they would attack the Russians from different positions at the same time. After coordinating the actions, it was time to open fire, and that meant the end for the enemy armored vehicles. The Kremlin vehicles failed to evade the accurate Ukrainian offensive and exploded into 1,000 pieces. Both the MTLB and the BMP-3 were reduced to dust, constituting a heroic maneuver that also served to completely neutralize the dozen Moscow fighters. The local battalion was able to stop the enemy's advance and force the invaders' attack line to retreat 10 kilometers, moving away from the city of Kharkiv. However, despite the great victory, the Ukrainian troops know that they cannot waste time celebrating. It is necessary to maintain a high combat rhythm in order not to give the rivals the opportunity to gain ground again.
Утро починається, якщо є БК, я ж кажу, коли було його досталь, то ми їх могли кошмарити 24/7. Щоб враг був уставший постійно. Держати їх постійно в напряженні в такому, тому що це теж прильоти, це теж осколки, це теж контузія, теж грає на нього. Деморалізація противника. Це наша ціль.
The commitment of these men can be seen every day in their tasks in the field. However, the actions against the powerful Russian armored vehicles were a special display of character. In fact, this event earned the 92nd Assault Brigade recognition from the government of its country. President Vladimir Zelensky himself was in charge of gathering the soldiers of the unit to present decorations. Lieutenant Denis Pilipchuk, who was in charge of the operation against the 2 infantry vehicles and their 12 Russian occupants, received the Cross of Military Merit. Meanwhile, 2 other warriors received the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and 5 more were awarded the Courage and Bravery Award. I want to ask you to convey my gratitude to your brothers in arms of the 92nd Brigade. They did not allow the enemy to pass. They are tough warriors. I am also grateful to other fighters from Kharkiv who fight in other units to defend Ukraine. Thank you and take care. I wish you strength, victory, and health, Zelensky said during the award ceremony. Like the soldiers, the Ukrainian president knows that the battle continues and the Kharkiv region will remain one of the epicenters due to its strategic importance. The Kremlin is also aware of all the advantages that can come from taking control of the city and will not stop so easily. Thus, as long as the war continues, Kharkiv will continue to be one of its main targets. This has been made clear by the incessant attacks and bombings that do not diminish, despite the brutal resistance of its rival.
Ситуация сложная, да, их тоже много, и дохнут они, я не знаю, чи их клонируют, там, чи что, где они их берут, и мрет же их много, и техники много палят, все равно и прут, да, ситуация тяжелая, но все же контролируем, ну, не все, конечно, но стараемся, где можем, везде стараемся контролировать, там, здесь поднасыпать им, что-то подсбить, там, здесь арта насыпет, або пехота наступит красиво, да, я же скажу, то, я считаю, что мы сами кращие фахивцы с тем, что у нас есть, то, я думаю, это вообще...
For feeling shared by this soldier that the presence of Russian troops never ends was felt again strongly during the first days of May 2024, when Moscow dramatically opened a new front in its war against Kyiv. The offensive in the Kharkiv region developed after some of the most difficult months for Ukrainian forces, overstretched and depleted after a brutal winter campaign in other regions of the country, which caused a serious shortage of ammunition. The attacks were particularly painful for local troops, as Russia again achieved victories in areas that had already been occupied in the past and liberated by the army, such as the town of Ivanovka. As if that were not enough, the escalation of hostilities had a new impact against civilian targets, generating significant casualties among the population. However, just 2 weeks into the Russian advance on Ukraine's second-largest city, it came to a screeching halt in the face of renewed and fierce resistance from several units, including the 92nd Assault Brigade, which was joined by additional battalions sent from the south. The brutality of the local forces' response prompted President Zelensky to declare on June 8th that Russia had failed in its offensive on Kharkiv, adding that Ukrainian troops were effectively stopping and destroying the enemy in the area.
Пизда им! Їх там двох було. Закидуєш?
While the Ukrainian leader's words were welcomed by the population, the judgment on the failure or success of the operation depends on the strategic objectives with which it was conceived. And in this sense, it is difficult to say exactly how far Moscow really hoped to advance. In general, analysts agreed that Russian forces had little or no chance of encircling and entering Kharkiv. However, experts also often frame the Kremlin's offensives as an attempt to create strategic dilemmas for its rival. That is, to deepen the problems of lack of resources, both in terms of weapons and the number of personnel. As of June 13th, the mapping of the terrain showed Russian troops occupying at least 183 square kilometers of the Kharkiv region, in addition to another portion called a gray zone because it is in dispute between both sides. However, Putin's men were unable to breach the strengthened Ukrainian defenses that halted their rivals' advance some 20 kilometers outside the main city. The 92nd Assault Brigade was again key in this task, defending the front from any kind of threat, including missiles and the highly effective drones that have caused great destruction throughout the conflict.
Неважно, типа, какое направление, вот, ну, именно касается то, что моя работа, за этих летающих плохолетов. Вот моя задача их просто напить с такой скоростью, чтобы они даже не понимали, что происходит, потому что вот его Шкода, которую он потом делает, это пи***ц. Да, это Орлан.
Following Ukrainian victories in halting the enemy advance, Kharkiv Governor Oleg Sinyagubov stated that Russian offensive operations had been scaled back with the loss of nearly 2,500 soldiers and more than 500 pieces of equipment in the area. Thus, the successful deployment of Ukrainian combat units and the stabilization of the front meant that not only would it be easier to defend the region in the future, but those units could soon be moved back to higher priority sectors to prove their high value. However, this also highlights the general personnel problems affecting the Kiev army that seem to persist, at least until the training of tens of thousands of new troops recruited under the new mobilization law is completed. At that point, Ukraine will be ready to increase its presence in the hottest areas of the war and will be able to definitively secure Kharkiv to prevent another Russian advance in the coveted region. As we come to the end of this video, we cannot forget the huge impact that these bloody clashes have had on the Ukrainian population. Because of the intensity of the fighting and the bombing, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced from the Kharkiv region. Many areas have been devastated, with essential infrastructure damaged or destroyed. In other words, it is not unreasonable to say that the war has caused a humanitarian crisis like never before seen in this area, with shortages of food, medicine, and basic services. In light of this, humanitarian organizations have worked to provide assistance, but the situation remains serious. In short, Kharkiv is one of the major axes of the conflict between the two belligerent nations. While it has been the bastion of Ukrainian identity and resistance against the Russian occupation, it is also the clearest postcard of the consequences of the war. The city seeks to remain the example of the country's sovereignty, but if it falls, it could become the greatest symbol of victory for Moscow. That's why this region carries a special weight in the fight, and sooner or later it will become the emblem of the eventual winner. Now, after learning about the most incredible clashes that took place in Kharkiv during the fierce war between Russia and Ukraine, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in the next installment of Military Force.